All right, if you will take your Bibles and turn to the book of Leviticus. And this morning, I want to just go through some of the things that we'll be seeing in the next couple days of our Bible reading. I'm going to just give kind of just a cursory overview of the different offerings that the children of Israel were instructed to bring to the Lord at the tabernacle. Last week, Dr. Mitchell filled in for me at the last minute and talked about the different furniture of the tabernacle. And I think he mentioned this a couple times, but I think I need to just remind us about the tabernacle in order for us to understand the offerings that we'll be reading about this coming week. So God, in Exodus, announced basically that he would dwell among his people. This is something that is it's impossible. How can God and man dwell together? And yet God announces that he will dwell in the midst of his people, and actually in the midst of all people, if we think about it. And so he announces that, and then he gives instructions on how, on the place that he would dwell. He is, of course, he is omnipresent and everywhere, but in the tabernacle, his glory, the Shekinah glory, people call it, would dwell right above the mercy seat, which would sit on the Ark of the Covenant. And that mercy seat and Ark of the Covenant would be right in the middle of the holiest of all, a separate room that was square or cubed, and it was part of the tabernacle tent, but it was the back part, we might say. It was if you were going to come into the tabernacle, you went, a priest, the high priest only actually, and we'll talk about this next week, would go through the holy place, and then he could go into the holiest of all. So God's glory dwells above the mercy seat, and that's an interesting point to think about. Most of the time when our human nature thinks about God, we think of God as a ruthless, all-powerful being that's just waiting to execute us, to punish us for the evil that we do. And we are evil and wicked. But God, in the tabernacle, God sat, he dwelt right above, not the judgment seat, but above the mercy seat. And he's a God of truth and mercy. We see just the fact that he would dwell amongst man is merciful and gracious. But, so we have this, the Holy of Holies is where God's glory dwells. And then there's the holy place that, let's see if I can get it right, that Dr. Mitchell described to us. And I think we have the candlestick on this side and the table of showbread here and the altar of incense here. And that's the holy place. And that tabernacle, those two rooms were part of the tent, or part of the tabernacle that had a multi-layered covering. We've read about that this week, the linen and the goats, the badger skins and the goat's hair and all of that covering over this tent. And that sits in the middle of a courtyard. So it's sitting in the middle of a 100 by 50 area that has curtains, has a wall around it. You can't just look in, as Dr. Mitchell described last week. It's got maybe a 7-foot curtain or wall. You couldn't really look in there. You might see the glory of the Lord above there, or if you were on a mountain up above it, you could look down and see. But there's a courtyard area And actually, between the dwelling places of the tribes of Israel and that curtain was the dwelling place of the tribe of Levi. The different sons of Levi had their dwellings between the courtyard and the tribes of Israel, and the priests, the family of Aaron, they dwelled between the front of the gate, the eastern gate, and I think it's eastern. Anyway, so you have all the tribe of Levi. Aaron, of course, is of the tribe of Levi, is between the people and the curtain. The curtain is between the Levites and the courtyard. In the courtyard, we have the bronze brazen altar and the bronze laver, and then that distance or space is between the curtain and the tent. And in the tent, we have a holy place, and then there's a veil of separation, very thick veil, and inside there is the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat and the glory of God dwelling upon that. And actually, if we think about it, so we have God in the midst there, and we have these layers of separation, we might say. We might look at it as layers of separation. And the tribes of Israel are really, they are just a layer between God and the whole world. The people of Israel were to show the rest of the world how men could dwell with God, and how God would take care of those that obeyed and followed him. And so the tabernacle is a wonderful sign, a symbol of how it is that God can dwell in the midst of sinful people. Everything in the tabernacle, as we mentioned last week, and every aspect of the tabernacle pictures Jesus Christ. And so it should remind us that Jesus Christ is God. And when he was God in the flesh, he dwelt in the midst of his people. And so the tabernacle pictures God. It pictures Christ, shows us that God will dwell with his people. But at the end of tomorrow, you'll read at the end of Exodus chapter 40, verse 34, "Then a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and Moses was not able to enter into the tent of the congregation because the cloud abode thereon." So God had ordained and created this way for mankind, for him to dwell in the midst of mankind, and yet man couldn't come to God. Because even though God has set everything up in order for him to dwell in the midst of his people, the people that he would dwell in the midst of are still sinners. They still can't come to God. When God is there, they can't come before him. And so that thought should introduce us to Leviticus, where we begin to see God says, okay, now I'm here, and this is how you can come to me. And it's exciting, and I'm just going to say it here at the beginning so that your mind follows along this way, is that everything that God set up for them as a way, as what to do so that they could come to God, also pictures Christ. Jesus Christ came and lived on the earth. He is God in the flesh, dwelling in the midst of his people, in the midst of all people. And he's also the way that anybody who will believe on him can have access to God. There's limits in the tabernacle to who can come close and closer and closest to God. But in Christ, every single one of us can come right into the throne room of God, right in before the mercy seat, and have grace to help in time of need. So when we think of, and I don't have the time to make all the connections, but if you have some extra time as we read through Leviticus, you might also read Hebrews. I think it's good for us as a church that Pastor Dameron just preached 13, 14 messages through Hebrews, reminding us that the Old Testament is just a shadow of the New Testament, that there are just pictures, figures of the real, of the true, which is Christ. And so let's just get into them. We don't have that much time, but there's to me, when we look at the offerings, either we're going to get into tremendous minute detail or we're going to overview. And I'm going to go with the overview this morning. The way to approach God, the Bible tells us, is by or with an offering. And the first 7 or 8 chapters of Leviticus list out for us many different offerings with different purposes. And so something to remember, that if we're going to come to God, our sin must be covered. Sin must be covered before access to God is allowed. Let's say I'm a Hebrew person, and I've just the blessings of God have just, overflowed my mind. And I think, I just want to go thank God for what He's given me. I have all this stuff. I want to give some to God. I couldn't just come with a thank offering. I would have to come and have my sins covered with a sin offering, and then I could offer my thank offering also. But let's just think through some of these, think through some of these offerings. The Levitical offerings, and each one pictures Christ. There's so many different things that we would want to offer, and in Leviticus, we have different ways to offer, but yet Christ is the one offering that encompasses all of those offerings, and He is so much better, as Hebrews tells us, and everlasting, eternal also. So I think we will go ahead and read chapter 1. I'll probably read it quickly, but there's a lot of parallels along the way. So I'll just read Leviticus 1. And the Lord called unto Moses and spoke unto him out of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, If any man of you bring an offering unto the Lord, ye shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd and of the flock. If his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd. So that's the first offering, is a burnt sacrifice that's being mentioned here. Let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. And he shall kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood round about upon the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into his pieces. And the sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire upon the altar and lay the wood in order upon the fire. And the priest, Aaron's son, shall lay the parts, the head and the fat, in order upon the wood that is in the fire, which is upon the altar. But the inwards and the legs shall he wash in water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. And if his offering be the flocks, namely of the sheep or of the goats, for a burnt sacrifice, he shall bring it a male without blemish. And he shall kill it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord, and the priest, Aaron's son, shall sprinkle his blood round about upon the altar. And he shall cut it into his pieces with his head and his fat, and the priest shall lay them in order on the wood that is on the fire, which is upon the altar. But he shall wash the innards and the legs with water, and the priest shall bring it all and burn it upon the altar. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. And if the burnt sacrifice for his offering be to the Lord be of the fowls, he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or of young pigeons. And the priest shall bring it unto the altar and wring off his head and burn it on the altar, and the blood thereof shall be wrung out at the side of the altar. And he shall pluck away his crop with his feathers and cast it beside the altar on the east part by the place of the ashes. And he shall cleave it with the wings thereof, but shall not divide it asunder. And the priest shall burn it upon the altar, upon the wood that is upon the fire. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. So we have descriptions of different types of animals that someone might bring as a burnt sacrifice, and how the offering should be killed, what should be done with the blood, what should be done with the remains. The ashes are here, the blood, it's killed here, the blood is on all around, and all of these things. And then let's go ahead and go over to Leviticus 6, verse 8. So we have the offerings mentioned first, and then there's what is called the law of the offerings. And there's a law of the offerings for each of the offerings, and the law of the burnt offering is in Leviticus 6, verse 8. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Command Aaron and his son, saying, This is the law of the burnt offering. It is the burnt offering because of the burning upon the altar all night unto the morning. And the fire of the altar shall be burning in it. And the priest shall put on his linen garment, and his linen breeches shall he put upon his flesh. And take up the ashes which the fire has consumed with the burnt offering on the altar, and he shall put them beside the altar. And he shall put off his garments and put on other garments and carry forth the ashes outside or without the camp unto a clean place. And the fire upon the altar shall be burning in it. It shall not be put out. And the priest shall burn wood on it every morning and lay the burnt offering in order upon it. And he shall burn thereon the fat of the peace offerings. The fire shall ever be burning upon the altar. It shall never go out. All right, so as we read through Leviticus, this first part, we're going to have a chapter on each of the different types of offerings, and then there's a section on the law of the offering that gives some more instructions about the offering. But the burnt offering is wholly, completely offered. There's nothing, the person who brings the offering doesn't partake in that offering in any way. And so most people think of it as an offering of surrender or of sacrifice, of just a total commitment. It is totally given to God. Then we have the meat offering, and in chapter 2, the meat offering is described, and as we see its description, we realize that the Old English meat stands for what we might call meal. So, because it's given with flour and these types of things, and then when we read other parts of, the meat offering, it can be fried in a pan or baked in the oven, or there's all kinds of different ways that it can be prepared with oil. And I don't know much about cooking, but I think when you take flour and oil and stuff and put it together with frankincense, it turns into quite a nice loaf of bread. I might be wrong there. But something that we should, I have realized a while back about these offerings, it says it's a sweet savor unto the Lord, and we look at it and think, it's awful. This is too, it's not this mundane, okay? It is an offering. But when you take your side of beef and you cut it into about 1 inch thick, and you put it on the fire, the wood fire, a grate of metal between the fire and the wood, and the fat of that offering falls down on the hot fire, it's pretty sweet savor. It's a sweet smelling savor. Okay, so and I guess what we should think is that many of the things that happened in the tabernacle, they were not just elevated spiritual things that nobody partook of, that was not enjoyable. This was how the priests ate their food. Much of the offering wasn't actually put on the altar. It was a portion of it was put on the altar, and some was just given to the priest. That's how the Levites, the whole tribe of Levi, ate from the offerings of the tabernacle. Now, the burnt offering, though, it was consumed completely. It's a different offering from the others. Anyway, moving along. The meat offering. So the meal offering is we read about in Leviticus 2, and the law or the rules, the law about the meal offering is in 6:14 through 18. Then the peace offering, we'll read about a peace offering in Leviticus chapter 3, and there's different types of peace offerings. Peace offerings were given, someone might give a peace offering because he was thankful to God. And in the peace offering, we read in the laws that there's a portion of the peace offering that was heaved, a heave offering. And actually, the heave offering belonged to the priest. Somebody might bring a peace offering if they were going to vow a vow, and they would seal that vow with an offering. Any free will offering, any offering that was just brought for any reason would be a peace offering. And there's also a wave offering that was part of the peace offering. So there's the peace offering is a sweet-smelling savor to the Lord type of offering. So we have the burnt offering, the meal offering, the meat offering, the peace offering. And then in chapter 4, we read about the sin offering. If a soul sin through ignorance against any of the commandments of the Lord concerning things which ought not to be done and shall do offense against any of them, then the description is given of the offering that someone would offer for their sin. It's kind of as we read through this, and then we come back and look at verse 2 of chapter 4. If a soul sinned through ignorance, maybe we would say when a soul sins through ignorance, or since a soul will sin through ignorance. If there's 613 or 623 laws. If a soul sinned through ignorance, this is what he should do. That's why I was saying if a person wanted to bring a peace offering, they would have to bring a sin offering also, because that you couldn't come before God without having the guilt of that sin covered with a sin offering. And then chapter 5 and much of chapter 7. The beginning of chapter 7 tells us about the trespass offering. A sin offering would be, just in very general terms, and don't hold me to this, but a sin offering is if we sinned in ignorance against God. And a trespass offering is when you trespassed your neighbor, when you did something wrong against your neighbor. You had to make an offering to the Lord for that, because it's easy to, if we think about it, sinning against our neighbor is not just a sin against our neighbor, but talks about restoring that and making restoration and making things right with a neighbor that you had sinned against. So I was teasing in the opening about chapter 13 Leviticus. I think it's chapter 13 and 14 where it talks about leprosy and all of that. Leviticus does get into a fair amount of minutia, we might think, but it is important. If it wasn't important, God wouldn't put it there. Some of it we don't understand why. We don't live with leprosy around us now. But these first 7-8 chapters, as we read through them on Tuesday and Wednesday, hopefully you don't get bogged down in if it was of the herd or a sheep or a goat or a turtle dove. I'm not saying not to read it, but remember, as we're reading through those things, these are things that God put in place. I think, remember they're Old Testament shadows of things that were to come. But try to imagine yourself being a Hebrew. And in one sense, the tremendous privilege it is that God would even tell you how you could come to him. The rest of the world just kind of looks on and wonders and tries to feel after God, as Paul says, some way, trying to figure out how to find God. And you, as a Hebrew in the Old Testament, would know, this is how I can come to God. And then think all the different offerings and all of this and all that, and you might say, well, I'm glad there were doctors of the law that knew that I would just come to the tabernacle and make sure that, now you're doing this right, aren't you? But then think of, so try to imagine yourself at that time following all these things, being careful, and really the privilege it is to be able to come before God even with all these rules and laws, and then try to conceive what a change Christ brought to humanity in that. We come along 2,000 years later, and it's simple. It's so simple that we sometimes devalue. We just, it's so simple, it's just say these words. And of course, it's not just say these words. But Christ is the answer for everything that God had said, well, if you're going to do this, you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this, because I'm holy, but I will let you come to me. Christ covers all of that. And the change that Christ made to a culture, and then, of course, he's the one that makes a change in our own lives and allows us to come before God. And so hopefully we can be encouraged and challenged to live for God in gratefulness and thankfulness by reading through these passages in Leviticus this week. Our Father, we thank you for your word and ask